record?
Yes, I hit record.
My name is John Andrew, and I have a story to tell. Growing up, I was a Valley kid, and it was a challenge. I grew up in North Kentfield, so not far from where I'm living now. But I was a pretty sensitive kid, and the neighborhood sometimes was a little rougher than I was comfortable for. In terms of a significant memory, my youth became quite troubled, and I would say probably fair to say, impacted by my own emotional challenges that came out of various hurts being a child and all of those things. And I did end up occasionally and frequently, I guess, being homeless and struggling with addiction. That seemed to be my focus was in life in my younger years, was trying to block out a lot of things. There were positive things. There was a sense of love growing up, but as a youth, I had a really hard time seeing anything positive about how I was raised, and really fell into a pretty self-destructive pattern for a number of years. In terms of significant people, I've been really fortunate. I would say I've been blessed by people who've come into my life at various times. I was a particularly stubborn person, I think, when life afforded opportunities. But probably, the most significant person, the person I would refer to as my spiritual dad, would have been Robin Marshall, who was a local guy, a local accountant, and he and his wife Kathy took me in, and I would run away or all kinds of things could happen, and they would take me in again and again. And he demonstrated just a great degree of patience and understanding with me over the years. Lots of other people were there for short periods of time as a youngster. My grandmother and my mother both gave a lot of love, but Robin would be the guy. He also had been a hippie at one point in his life, and he was cool in my books. So because of that, I was willing to listen to his wisdom and experience. Well, I think in terms of I think there's been a number of pivotal points in life. There've been a number of things that have kind of shaped who I am. I don't know how transparent I should be, but I as a young kid, I was assaulted. I was abused as a kid, and that was at this stage of my life. I've dealt with that, and it gives me a desire to be a healer and to be a person who helps other people work through those things. But in terms of a negative thing, that was really the thing. I was 33 years old, 47 now, 33 years old before I was able to share that and begin to come out of this shell, this wall that I built around myself to protect myself. And so a very negative thing, but I've been able to turn that, I think, into some positive. The experiences in my life really have played out, in terms of everything, in terms of where I am now. For me, in 1998, there was a time in my life where I had a series of encounters, and I guess you could say I had a spiritual experience, and turned to God and turned to faith, and began to work at that point, began to have a desire to make a difference and a positive impact in other people's lives. Began to work with youth, managed a youth shelter, and then eventually found myself going to the divinity school at Acadia. And it was while I was at Acadia that myself and another classmate began to really explore how we could help people in practical ways, and also bring a holistic approach, bring this message of hope and purpose to others, and so that began to open arms, began to take shape out of that. Although I, in some ways, feel fairly removed from the type of pain and anxiety and fear and things that I grew up with, the those things really help me understand, I think, a lot of times the people that we're dealing with and the obstacles to life. I was not a person, because of my addictions and lifestyle choices, I was not a person until I was 30 years old or thereabouts. I wasn't in a position where I could keep down a constant job or be reliable really to anyone in my life, and it was really a whole lot of hurt and pain behind that, and because of that, I guess I'm willing to give some grace to others who are in similar situations. The top 3 lessons that I've learned in life, and I don't know if I can give you 3, but I guess one of the things is to understand the limits of my own ingenuity, the limits of my own strength, and for me that's been a turning to God ultimately. That's been a message of faith, and also that there's time spent on what we might call self-care and spiritual development, all those things. It was hard to slow down and begin that process, but it was necessary for me, and that is time well spent. However that manifests itself for different people will use different strategies for that. For me, that's probably I would say it's have a life that's established on faith, but also you have to work it. You have to work the program, so to speak. And as I get a little bit older, I guess the other thing that would be, I don't know if I'm answering exactly the way you want, but the other thing that is extremely important, more and more, is family, and the people in my life, and that's not necessarily always people that I'm related to, but people who are dear friends, and to invest time in those people, because after all the busyness is done, after the day is done, to invest time in the people who are going to be there for you in the good and the bad. In terms of people who want to give back, obviously I'm not alone in terms of a person who, in my own gratitude towards people and who've helped me along the way, and I think do it. There are many people, and I think gratitude plays out that way. Gratitude always translates into wanting to serve others and wanting to give back and wanting to be generous, and there's great healing in that. Although hopefully the motive isn't to fix yourself. It's amazing what happens when we do dive into giving back to our neighbors and strangers, and that suddenly we're less self-absorbed, and there is a healing that almost happens spontaneously as we venture into that territory. For people who are struggling, I think the answer is always the same. I think that each of us is very unique in our character and who we are, in our gifts and skills and abilities, but human pain and suffering and loss are not as unique. I think people who are struggling, your struggles, there is someone, not who can understand completely, but there is someone out there who's been through similar things, and I think for people to know that they're not alone. Well, the journey to Open Arms becoming what it is, I had already begun to work with youth and various things, and had 2 years at the Divinity College, and went through a time of breaking in my own life, and even though I had a couple of years in being of sobriety and kind of on the right track, I went through a divorce in the middle of seminary, and I was once again forced to re-examine, to reevaluate everything in my life. And what I found was, and I expected to be judged. I expected people to say, well, you shouldn't be here, and from the principal of the school down, people extended a lot of grace to me, and during that time, it really redirected me, because I think being in seminary, I probably was steering towards church ministry, and began to look at things from the perspective of being really broken and disappointed. And myself and a fellow student, we spent a lot of time, we studied together, and spent a lot of time with he and his wife and kids, and I became kind of part of their family, and so we became good buddies, and began to. It was kind of a mission. It was kind of a ministry. It was kind of, but it was more a couple of guys with an idea, with a heart, and with backpacks on our backs, and it was about connecting with people for coffee. It didn't take very long doing Open Arms, and before other people we started to see the real need that was there. We started to get calls from the military base, the Air Force Base in Greenwood, to do family mediation. We started to get calls from schools and from police and from the hospital to assist people, to connect with people. So we found suddenly that this idea of creating, of being kind of ad hoc helpers, chaplains, advocates for people who were broken. Suddenly we discovered that it was the need and the demand was there, and we felt incredibly underqualified, both of us did, but people needed us, and we began to step into that. So it was really on-the-job training, and initially it was about just chaplaincy, advocacy. There was we wondered how people connected with resources, whether those resources were churches or other social helps that were out there. How did people connect? And at that time, our Access Nova Scotia office was in town, and we had a conversation with a wonderful person who worked there, and said, what do people do? How do people manage this? Because we realized that people who were poor and broken in various ways, they lacked transportation. They may be illiterate, and so how do they connect with these things? How do they obviously don't walk around with daytimers, and at that time it would have been Blackberries, and so how do they organize their lives? How do they do this? And we discovered there was a collection of resources, but it was kind of kept, it was the best kept secret in the valley, I think, and so it was kept behind the desk, and it was, so you'd have to know it was there, you'd have to be able to get there, and you'd have to know how to read it. And so we, shortly thereafter, we did a little bit of time out of Wolfville Baptist Church. We were permitted to do shelter out of Wolfville Baptist Church, and then we made the decision based on the needs we saw to make Kentville kind of the center of the work. And we rented a very inexpensive office. We got a telephone hooked up, and we had an outdated copy of this book of resources. And from there, we began to connect with people. And it wasn't long, however, before we discovered that there was this vast need for shelter. Now, not the longer term shelter like we see in the cities, but there were kids and parents in conflict. There were, boyfriends and girlfriends, husbands and wives in conflict. So we discovered there were lots of people who were in crisis, and from domestic abuse, and oftentimes the police would show up, and there'd be a youth or a husband or maybe a landlord who kicked somebody out, or there were all these situations, and they didn't require that someone needed months and months. And in fact, consistently over the last 14 years of doing shelter now, the average every year is right around 9 days that it takes from the time someone comes destitute with no money, and all that kind of thing, to get them housed in an apartment, or whether it's temporary or permanent. So it was wonderful to be able to do that, and it increased each year. And I think 2006 or 2007 was the last year we were able to do emergency shelter full-time. We started doing a seasonal program with the help of churches. At that time, we had done several years of doing shelter, just the two of us and a few people who jumped on board. So it was a very small group of volunteers, and we were doing it year-round. We simply burned out. The last year that we did shelter year-round, every day, there were 133 persons, different individuals, who used the shelter at least one night, and that would be the short period of time, and some of them maybe took a couple of months even to get their feet back on the ground. So we were really tired. We were students. We were doing this project at night, so you try to juggle and try to get your schoolwork done at night. My partner in ministry was an assistant pastor as well at the time, and I was even doing some landscaping jobs and picking apples, and so we got really creative. We never really we didn't have any idea how all-encompassing it could be, and it did become exactly that. And what became kind of swallowed up was that vision of being chaplains, community chaplains, or advocates for people in need, getting them to people to court and to doctor's appointments and all those things, kind of went by the wayside for a while. So we devised a plan. We got a spot to do a drop-in center, and the idea was that we would try to bring in some more volunteers from the community, and we would have a place where people were using the shelter, and then they could have intake in the morning. And that worked really well, but it worked too well, because we would have a couple of guests, and they would come, and we would help develop a life plan, and or that guest would give us a report on what they'd accomplished the day before, and their ability to, or our willingness to keep hosting them was directly contingent upon their ability to, or willingness to be part of that action plan that they helped to develop. But what happened is we started opening the mornings for intake, and then people would be knocking on the door and peeking in the windows, and we discovered this whole community of people who were either lonely or physically disabled, or intellectually challenged, or addicted, who weren't sure where they belonged. They didn't fit. And they wanted a place to go. So what we discovered over the last few years, it was not part of the plan, was this community that formed. And to this day, we have mornings. We still do intake, and we have some volunteers who specifically do that. But we have anywhere from 30 to 50 people who would come every morning, 6 mornings a week, to our drop-in center in Kentville. And as the volunteer base has grown to somewhere around 250 or more people in between shelter and the drop-in in Kentville, the drop-in in Berwick, and we have some mobile outreach and a little bit more than that happening in the next short while in Kingston. So this volunteer base has grown, which means that some of us have been able to return to doing some of that chaplaincy kind of thing. And once we've been 14 years at this now, so chaplaincy has taken all kinds of forms. It's those people we meet who come in and need shelter, and maybe need some spiritual counsel or some emotional supports. It can mean addiction supports. It also has meant over that period of time that I've been privileged to do a number of funerals for people we've known, and in many cases seen them progress in their lives. In some cases they've fallen back into addiction. In some cases it's just been simply people who are elderly and don't have a lot of connections in the community beyond open arms, and so I've been honored to be able to give them that dignity of a good send-off. So, if anyone takes the time to listen to my story, and like every story, I guess it's hard to tell it in a short period of time, but I guess that a bad story can turn good. Things that are hard and challenging can be turned good if we're committed to, I guess, taking responsibility for our part in the ills of life, in where our lives have gone wrong, and being thankful, being gracious, and having a desire to give back. And it doesn't mean I've done, nor do I do everything perfect, but it really is a privilege and an honor to give back after years of really being a receiver and sometimes even a user, to say, wait a minute, I love this place, I love this community, I love the people here, this is my family, and I hope that people would get that idea, and also that people would, who have a loved one who's struggling with addiction or mental health issues or crime or whatever it may be, not to give up. I think sometimes you do have to, particularly when it's family, you need to step back, but continue to love them, to be gracious where you can. If you're a praying person, to pray for them, and it's amazing what happens. And it's been said to me by someone made the comment in the community a while ago, someone who was not overly fond of me when I was in high school, and they made the comment. They said someone must have been praying for him, and and that is true. There was a change. So I think if people can get inspiration, it doesn't have to be that you found an organization. It can be that you partner with an organization or a project that's already off the ground. But it may be. I don't think there's any limit to what people can do to really help the community and the people in it. I guess, well, one question, I guess, I don't know how you'd phrase it as a question, you know, but what keeps us going, I guess. If you were to ask a question, if I were to say there's one question that you should have asked, it'd be, what keeps you going? And I guess it's a mixture of things. It's the success stories, and those success stories, we don't gauge or measure those success stories the way many people would. It doesn't. We have people in our community who are simply not able to work, and we know they're not going to. But the fact that they maybe participate in learning how to draw, or learning how to cook, or they just simply engage in conversation more, or they can be really small things. And you know, we have one lady who comes here, and we actually thought for the first couple of years she came, we actually assumed she was nonverbal, and it took a long time before she would take her coat off, and you'd have to be very gentle. She was very timid, and we don't know all of her story, of course, but eventually she chucked her coat off, and she, you know, it took a couple of years for that to happen. And more recently, discovered that the doctors discovered that she was actually deaf, and so she's been going through speech therapy and learning to speak. So those are victories. Or the person who used to sell drugs and now doesn't, and maybe is participating in addictions groups. Or so we have lots of those stories, and yes, we do have some people who've gone from the point of being destitute to going to school, to going to college, to doing upgrading. That's one of the things we love to see people do. We have those stories, but a lot of times it's simple things, and we know that in many cases too, some of our people are going to take some steps backwards, but we can celebrate with them that maybe for the first time they were able to live in an apartment and take care of themselves for 6 months before they relapsed or whatever it may be. So I guess that's one question, and maybe another question that is, what is the greatest need? I guess that would be a question perhaps and the greatest need, the greatest void I guess we see is really ultimately it's loneliness. It's that need for connectiveness. It's that need for community. There's something just essential. I mean, it's not news that we are social beings. But when someone has become an addict or committed crimes or even been mentally ill, they've oftentimes severed a lot of the core relationships they have. So to build relationships afresh, and again, gives them a fresh start. It gives them a chance to become contributors to society. It decreases, you get connected with community, you're much less likely to commit crime. You're much less likely for mental health issues to rear their head in a terrible way. So the loneliness. There are people who come when we provide meals and when we're hosting various events, who come because they're legitimately hungry, and that does happen. But more often than not, this has simply become a safe place for them. It's become a place of community for them, and that's while that was not our intent was crisis response in a chaplaincy kind of context. We actually really love the community that gathers here every morning and most evenings as well. If someone wanted to help with Open Arms, they can certainly, the best thing is to come by. Mornings are best, but if not, people can call 902-365-3665, and we will get back to them. We have an application process, and I would say, what do we need for skills here? What do we need for volunteers? Pretty much anyone. Pretty much any kind of skill. We have a need for overnight shelter monitors. We have a need for people to make breakfast. We have a need for people just to sit and have a coffee, listen to someone, have a game of cards. Those things can be really just as important as anything that I do here is the bonds and the relationships that form through people just, I guess it's that connectiveness that happens. And if there's one thing that we do here, I certainly don't do all of the work that happens here, but if we can facilitate people who have, connecting with people who do not have, then we bridged that gap or that divide that is out there, and it does break down that prejudice that can exist when we see someone, and I'm as guilty of it as the next person. When we see someone who speaks a certain way, or smells a certain way, or dresses a certain way, it can be very easy to make a quick judgment. But when we hear their story, usually we would say, my God, no wonder that person is in that condition. I wouldn't even be able to survive in many of the situations that some of our friends have come through in terms of backgrounds of abuse and that kind of thing. So, the way we run programs is we have one person who is a volunteer here, and initially started as a participant. And this person said to me a number of years ago, said, "What are we going to do next year?" And it turned a light on in me, where I understood what he meant. And what he meant was, what are we going to do differently? And I'll tell you, the way we do things, we just recently ran a course called the Alpha Course, and people liked that, and we're going to run another one. It's a simple course in Christianity, and a meal accompanies that. So we had a small group, and then we're going to do that one more time because there seems to be a need or a demand for that. We kind of allow the people who come here to say what they want. So sometimes a program we have run, we're not currently, we've run addictions programs, and that's come as the people have said, hey, we want to do this, and we want to talk about this, or we want to learn about this. We have a partnership with the Valley Community Learning Association, and they host an art and literacy program that's here, and that's a wonderful program that anyone can come and participate in, and that also helps them build relationships as a partner, because they do adult education. So hopefully someone comes in, they sit down, they maybe even publish a book, or they tell their stories if they can't, and someone will write for them if they can't write. Many people do artwork. And that hopefully is a lead-in to people doing other courses. We had one individual who took a couple of years, but got his GED, and we were able to get a cake and make a graduation hat and celebrate that, and it was awesome. And then, but as soon as that was done, he wanted to do some other kind of course. He wanted to learn something else, and so there's. I would once again just say that our doors are open to skills, abilities, gifts. Every one of us, I think, has something we can share, and in fact, maybe we're robbing the community if we don't share those gifts and skills that we have with others.